Switching gears to the science, and I use that in the loosest term possible, the science of global climate change. Our next guest is a physicist. He says carbon dioxide emissions are something that the world has seen for its entire history and can actually be beneficial to an ecosystem rather than a burden. He argues that rising CO2 levels are only very weakly linked to rising temperatures and actually would increase productivity. He wrote a big piece with another person that was actually on Apollo 17, one of the astronauts, in the Wall Street Journal a week or two ago that we're going to show you a shot of. But he's Professor William Happer of Princeton University, who co-wrote the article in the journal called In Defense of Carbon Dioxide. It appeared in the journal a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Harrison Schmitt. And you're a physicist, so we're immediately going to hear that you're not really... you don't have enough background to be judging climate science at this point, and that 98% of climate scientists say there is a link between carbon dioxide and warming. You say there's not, or a very weak link.
Well, you can look at the record, geological record, and, we have proxies for carbon dioxide over millions of years, hundreds of millions of years.
And we're at 400 parts per million.
Right.
In the past, we've seen what type of levels in the past?
4,000.
4,000 parts per million. All right.
Oh, but now...
Hold on. I saw Al Gore say these are the highest levels in human history. If you look at the length, if you look at the age of the Earth, and represented in hours of a day, the Earth is 24 hours old. Man has been around for 11 seconds out of the 24 hours. So it's true that we haven't been at 400 parts per million, but we've been at 1,000 parts per million. We've been at 4,000 parts per million in the Phanerozoic era, correct? Mm-hmm. Did you see warming, and do we know whether the warming came before the CO2 levels went up or as a result of the CO2 levels?
Well, the Earth is almost always warming or cooling. The most dramatic example of that is this series of ice ages that we're living through in the last few million years. But during that time, for sure, there's a correlation between CO2 and temperature, but temperature always changes first, and then CO2 follows.
Well, that doesn't help. Here's one of the quotes from the piece, and we'll also, hopefully we can look at a couple of charts. The cessation of observed global warming for the past decade has shown how exaggerated NASA and other computer predictions of warming have been and how little they correlate. I hope we can look at, has there been any global temperature increase since 1998?
No.
And you can see that plotted by objective scientific organization.
Yes, there are many records. There are surface records, there are satellite records. Yes.
Now, considering that CO2 has increased every year concentration since 1998, I have seen them go back, the computer models, I've seen them go back to try to explain why there's been no warming since 1998. And the latest is that there's a layer in the middle of the ocean that's absorbing more heat than normal. Have you seen?
Yes, I've seen that, yeah.
And they'll also say that 15 years is too short a period to say that it's not happening. And yet their entire thesis is based on 150 years of warming out of a 4 billion-year-old planet. I didn't need you here, I don't think. Let's look at
what he said.
Like a defense attorney.
I wasn't going to let you get to the point. I'm just trying to make the point that CO2 is not a demon. I wasn't going to let you get to the point where you're saying 1,000 parts per million would actually help the planet. That's your thesis, is it not?
Oh, yes. I think 1,000 parts per million would be better for the planet.
Well, how?
Well, agricultural productivity is already going up from the small amount of CO2 increase we've already had. If you look around the world, you find many greenhouse operators who put in several thousand parts per million
into their
greenhouses.
Well, people don't want to live in those greenhouses, right? I mean, the data
would there be any negative effects of breathing 1,000 parts per million CO2?
Absolutely
what are you talking
not.
about? You don't want to live there. 1,000 parts per million?
Well, no, hold on. All I was going to suggest, and I'm not a scientist and I'm not an expert on this, so I will admit it's hard for me to push back, but I read, and the readings would suggest that we haven't had this amount of carbon while humans have been around. So we've talked about a lot of data over a very long period of time.
0.04%.
But we're not talking about a period where we've been around and we're here and what our impact is or is not.
Well, our primate ancestors were here when CO2 levels were 3,000 parts per million. That was roughly 70, 80 million years ago. That's when we evolved.
Not that long ago on a 4 billion planet.
So it was 10 times what it is now. And We also let our sailors in submarines live in atmospheres that are several thousand parts per million.
Professor, what can you explain to me why well-intentioned people that are, I can't imagine that they, that if we go another 5 or 6 years where temperatures don't rise, they're going to have to revisit all of these models because it's going to be obvious that the anecdotal evidence isn't supporting the models that they've done. Will they go back and revisit it and maybe say, gosh, maybe we were wrong? What is it that causes it to be such a zealous, sort of almost a secular religion with these people?
Well, I think they already are revisiting the models, and many of them are saying they probably overestimated, many numbers in the models. The models are extremely complicated. You have the sun, you have the cooling, you have
water vapor.
Complicated.
Water vapor isn't a product of the hydrocarbon.
But when people talk about the increase in ocean levels, when you see these images up in Alaska or Greenland
of the receding glaciers,
most of which receded prior to 1900.
How do you explain that, or do you write that off? What's the...
Well, of course.
I'm just telling you as a spectator here.
Yes,
this is what I see. This is what I read, and I need to understand what to think of it because you're telling me to think of it very differently than the way it's being portrayed.
Yeah, you should make a trip to Glacier Bay, and that's very impressive. The glaciers there are all gone, and they disappeared in the 1800s. In fact, that was one of the most famous trips of John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, was to visit Glacier Bay in 1879. And he pointed out all the glaciers were gone. That was long before there was any increase of CO2.
So basically, to summarize, the stat that we keep seeing of 97% of climate scientists, they're wrong, and we should, don't worry, be happy, burn, burn, burn. Is that the bottom line?
Well, first of all, the statistics on the 97% are a little phony. If you look at the questions, they are, does CO2 affect the climate? I would say yes. Yeah, so I would be part of the 97%.
You wouldn't be asked because you're a physicist, though.
So they don't ask the question,
they don't,
let's freak out
you
and
can
not burn
design
any
a
more
poll
carbon.
to get any answer you wish.
What are the claims we're hearing that we're having these severe storms across the world, hurricanes and Sandy and stuff because of climate change? Is that true? Or is
that's even more preposterous than the link.
Well, you can look at the data. There's no evidence in the data.
So there's no evidence that we're having bigger storms because of this?
There were 3 storms that hit the East Coast, New York, that were twice as strong as Sandy in 1 year in 1954, and that's only how many years ago? And we have guys like Bloomberg saying vote for President Obama because of Sandy, because of climate change. We just had a tornado. I made this point earlier today. We had a bad tornado in the last couple of days down in Texas, but it's a 60-year low right now in terms of tornado activity. In terms of hurricanes, it's about an 8-year low, or it's never been 8 years where we haven't had a Category 5 or 4 or 5, something greater than 3 hit land. So it's never been this long, 8 years. You've got, if an adverse climate event occurs anywhere in the globe, you're going to read about it in the New York Times. You're going to read about flooding in Pakistan, and they're going to attribute that. Your entire life, there have been climate events.
So we're talking about your point. Then why does this keep on getting repeated and repeated? I mean,
I don't know. Why
do you think they keep on covering this story?
It's not just the New York Times. It's just about every.
But every article I've read,
it's most scientists.
But they take the models, they take where you're going to be, and then they extrapolate where the tides will be, where the ocean levels will be.
It is most scientists.
It's not most
like a minority.
Not most scientists.
You don't feel like a minority?
Well, a small minority. I think if you honestly poll the scientists, you have found about half are on my side.